24th, 1947, Mount Rainier, Washington. Civilian pilot Kenneth Arnold would be flying around Mount Rainier in Washington state looking for a downed military aircraft. What Kenneth Arnold would not expect is to have his own personal encounter with something up in the skies with him that he truly could not explain. Argued as perhaps the first widely publicized case of a UFO sighting, Arnold's sighting that day caused a massive domino effect throughout the United States that involved multiple sightings. Arnold's involvement in another possible UFO sighting before he had his in Maury Island, Washington, a crashed B-25 bomber, a commercial aircraft pilot having a sighting after leaving Boise, Idaho later on that same year, and supposed government cover-ups in multiple supposed hoaxes riding the coattails of a hot story. Today, on Unblurring the Unknown, perhaps the Kickstarter of the UFO phenomenon in the United States as we know it, as we explore the Kenneth Arnold sighting, the Maury Island Incident, the Flight 105 sighting, and the 1947 Flying Saucer Craze. Welcome back to Unblurring the Unknown. As always, I am your host, Dominic, and today we have a loaded topic. But before I dive into this loaded topic, I want to say again, last week I did not publish an episode. I didn't put a disclaimer out there on my social medias, but I unfortunately was gone this past week. I had a conference, if you will, that I had to attend to, so I did not have an episode this past week. Again, I kind of apologize for the inconsistency of me putting up episodes. I do apologize, that's on me. But I want to get back into kind of the routine of everything, so I felt it was only fair if I went and did an all-out episode where I dug up every stone, every nook and cranny, explored it all, and I found this topic for today. And I very well could have picked these to do as kind of individuals, but I decided to just kind of smash them all together because there's a lot of elements of each story that kind of plays into each other, and I felt like you couldn't tell one chunk of this story without telling all of the story. So I've just opted to tell you all of the story. Now, like I said, loaded topic, and this is kind of an amalgamation of so many different topics just kind of mashed into one. Now, originally I had planned on covering just the Maury Island Incident, but the further I dug into that case, the more Kenneth Arnold's name appeared, and kind of the more to the story I found kind of dug me up to the 1947 Flying Saucer Craze, and kind of everything that happened in those months following Kenneth Arnold's sighting near Mount Rainier in Washington state. Now, those of you who have listened to the show know that I have briefly mentioned Kenneth Arnold's name before, and I have teased doing an episode on it for a very long time, and it is finally time to cross that bridge and cover his story as well as all the other moving pieces that go along with it. Just before we get started, let's get some context. Kenneth Arnold's sighting in June 24th of 1947 would have this type of snowball effect and would cause many other people to report having sightings of their own of lights in the sky. Most notable, the Maury Island Incident, where Harold Dahl, a harbor patrolman scavenging lost logs from logging boats in Puget Sound, Washington, would have a sighting of his own. This would then snowball into an investigation headed by Arnold to investigate the legitimacy of Harold Dahl's story. Included in this same investigation was a pilot friend of Arnold's, E.J. Smith, who on July 4th of 1947 would have his own run-in with strange lights in the sky that he could not explain while traveling from Boise, Idaho to Pendleton, Oregon. These sequences of events, while all isolated, have established the making of pretty much the beginning of UFO recorded and published history, with 1947 being the catalyst of it all. After all three of these sightings are greatly overshadowed by the events of July 8th, 1947, when the infamous and legendary Roswell incident would take place. On today's episode, I'm going to try and lay down all the facts for you and dive into each one of these sightings, question their authenticity later on in our theories, and kind of how all these stories play off of each other. And once we finish telling this story in its entirety, I will wrap it up with my own thoughts and theories, whether or not I think these experiences were real, and offer up my opinions on this as well. However, just an FYI, before I dive into this whole story, it has a lot of moving pieces. So, pay attention, as I will kind of be throwing names at you left and right. I'll try and speak slow. Obviously, those of you who listen to the show know that I speak really fast, so I'll try and slow it down for you so you can understand and you can follow along with me, because this is kind of a ride from start to finish with all of these sightings and all of these names that I'm going to throw at you. So, with all that being said, let's dive into the story. Our story starts with Kenneth Arnold and his sighting on June 24th, 1947. Kenneth Arnold was an experienced pilot with over 4,000 hours of flight time. Now, while originally living in Boise, Idaho, at the time of the incident, he was actually departing Chehalis, Washington in his Cal Air A-2 light airplane. He was heading to attend an air show in Pendleton, Oregon, and was scheduled to have a fuel stop in Yakima before making his final destination in Pendleton. Now, while in the air, Arnold decided to make a little detour off of his expected route. He had heard wind of a crashed U.S. Marine Corps plane, a Curtiss C-46 Commando transport plane with 32 Marines on board. Now, the plane had supposedly crashed somewhere around the Mount Rainier area, and there was a $5,000 reward to anyone who could locate this plane. Now, this, of course, would be quite a handsome chunk of change, and it was definitely worth the time for Arnold to try his luck and see what he could find, since he was flying already in that general area. Just before 3 p.m. that afternoon, as Arnold was flying approximately 20 miles away from Mount Rainier, he would see a bright light off in the distance. The light was more of like a flash, and he had thought that some other military aircraft was also looking for the downed plane. Arnold was quoting as saying, "It startled me. I just assumed it was some military lieutenant out with a shiny P-51, and I'd caught the reflection of the sun hitting the wings of his plane." As Arnold looked closer around the objects, he could see another aircraft off in the distance, and he quickly ruled out that this light that he was seeing wasn't coming from that plane, but rather a different aircraft, something else. It wasn't this plane off in the background that the sun caught at a specific angle or anything like that. This was a different airplane or a different aircraft. Now, as Arnold got closer to the light and this light kind of came more into focus, it wasn't just one aircraft, but multiple. Arnold had observed 9 shiny objects flying in formation, with that formation stretching roughly 5 miles long from the first aircraft to the end aircraft. Arnold would describe all of these objects as circular, approximately 100 feet long. Arnold described these strange craft as bobbing and weaving back and forth, and almost flying similar to a kite, as well as they would sometimes flip up and back down. As his formation passed in front of Arnold's plane, he decided to observe them and time their speed from Mount Rainier to Mount Adams, which is roughly a shade under 50 miles apart. After observing them, Arnold came to the conclusion that these objects were flying faster than anything humans were capable of, and that they were flying faster than the speed of sound. Keep in mind, this is 1947, and humans had not yet broken the sound barrier. By Arnold's math, he predicted they were flying at a whopping 1,200 miles an hour. Arnold would later compare their motion to, and I quote, "a saucer if you were to skip it across the water." Now, that statement in and of itself is where we get the infamous term of flying saucer. Now, when Kenneth Arnold landed his plane, he would spread this story of what he saw up in the sky, and eventually he was approached by newspapers wanting to do interviews and tell his story. It took off, and the idea of this quote-unquote flying saucer was born. Arnold was a skeptic at first, as he wanted to believe that this was something other than a UFO. But once the idea of a military testing flight was ruled out, it became clear nothing could account for the objects Kenneth Arnold saw up in the sky that afternoon. Kenneth Arnold became somewhat of a hot story with his sighting. However, it would be just the tip of the iceberg in regards to the subsequent events after Arnold's sighting. As the Kenneth Arnold sighting was gripping newspapers and dominating the headlines, 2 days later, on June 26, Captain Emil J. Smith, also known as E.J. Smith, was a veteran pilot for United Airlines, and he was approached by reporters asking his take on the rash of quote-unquote flying saucer sightings being reported from all over the Northwest. Captain Smith was a routine flyer of the Northwest, so if anyone knew these skies the best, you could argue it was Smith. Captain Smith told reporters, and I quote, "I've never seen anything like that, and the boys say they haven't either. What the other fellow probably saw was the reflection of his own instrument panel. Later on the 4th of July, 1947, as Captain Smith was preparing for his flight that night, United Airlines Flight 105 from Boise, Idaho to Seattle. While walking up the ramp into the plane, someone around Captain Smith mentioned the rash of flying saucer sightings, and Captain Smith at this point was an extreme skeptic, and he simply replied with, "I'll believe in those discs when I see them." At 9:04 p.m., UAL Flight 105 would depart Boise en route for Seattle, as Captain Smith and his co-pilot Ralph Stevens departed Boise. Air traffic controllers made a small comment along the lines of making sure they were on the lookout for flying saucers. Both pilots, of course, took this as a joke, but it turns out these two pilots would have an encounter of their own. Shortly after takeoff from Boise, Captain Smith and Ralph Stevens would watch as 5 disc-shaped objects would enter their field of view in front of their airplane. Smith and Stevens were stunned at what they were looking at. One of the 5 disc-like crafts was bigger than the others, and they approached their airplane head-on before rapidly changing direction and flying parallel to the airplane. Smith and Stevens, unsure of what they were even looking at, flashed their landing lights to see if they could elicit some type of reaction from the craft. When doing so, the aircrafts in question slightly broke formation from kind of tight-knit and close together to more spread out and more loosely scattered in the sky. Smith and Stevens were able to keep this group of objects in their view for 45 minutes before that group of objects, or discs, disappeared and another group of 4 then appeared. This new group of objects didn't stick around as nearly as long, as they would then merge together in a tight formation and flew off towards the northwest. Flight 105 was scheduled to have a stop in Pendleton, Oregon, before making its way to Seattle. So after this sighting, Smith radioed ahead to air traffic control in Pendleton to alert them of what they just saw in the sky. In addition to Smith and Stevens, the flight attendant on board, Marty Morrow, verified the sightings as she too saw these weird disc-shaped craft. Once landing in Pendleton, newspapers and press were already on the scene and on the telephone, wanting to hear about the story and Captain Smith's experience on the plane. Captain Smith was pretty shaken up from the ordeal, but he held nothing back and was very forthcoming with reporters about what he saw that night. Captain Smith was, of course, a known skeptic. However, after this experience, he became much more interested in the phenomenon of flying saucers, and his sighting in particular stands as a big one to take place in this short period of time. Now, after all, you are talking about a multi-witness sighting that took place over a period of approximately 10 to 12 minutes, and to top it all off, the weather was really good that night as well, so Captain Smith and Ralph Stevens, his co-pilot, had a very good look at these objects, and they described the objects as round, flat on the bottom, and rounded on top, albeit kind of like a roughish rounded, and Smith would say that these objects had no tails or visible wings. Now, pretty much at this point, even though the Arnold sighting and the sighting by E.J. Smith, Ralph Stevens, and the stewardess on Flight 105, both of these seemed extremely credible. The U.S. military would really just go on to chalk these sightings up to misidentification of actual aircraft or actual phenomenon. In the case of Kenneth Arnold, they stated that it was a mirage that Arnold saw. For Flight 105, theories such as birds, regular aircraft, balloons, and also some type of optical illusion were presented, but of course Arnold and Smith would stand by about what they saw in the sky. The Captain Smith sighting is significant in the grand scheme of sightings that took place in this short window of time in 1947. But shortly after this sighting, another sighting would come into the public's eye, and it would involve both Kenneth Arnold and Captain E.J. Smith being tasked to investigate the veracity of this sighting. Rewind to June 21st, 1947. So keep in mind, this would take place before Kenneth Arnold's sighting. A harbor patrolman named Harold Dahl was out in Puget Sound, Washington, near Maury Island. He was out there with his son, a couple crew members, and a dog that worked with the men. The men aboard this boat were actually patrolling the harbor and water for lost logs that had fallen off of logging transport boats. While patrolling the harbor, something in the sky caught the attention of Dahl. Up in the sky were 6 donut-shaped aircraft. Based on Dahl's description, he observed one craft appearing to be in trouble as it seemed to be descending rather rapidly, while the 5 other donut-like aircraft were around the 6th, descending with it, albeit not as fast. The 6th donut-shaped craft was only about 500 feet off the ground when Dahl and the men observed the object with apparent help from the other craft. It started to discharge material from the inside ring of this donut-shaped craft. Dahl said the object would drop 2 different kinds of material, one being what looked like very thin sheets of metal, which at first glance Dahl compared to that of sheets of aluminum, or kind of looking like newspapers. The second material was this much larger black rock-like material that Dahl said looked like lava rock and took to calling slag. Dahl and the crew members of this boat watched and observed the craft dump this material, and as these black lava rocks hit the surface of the water in the harbor, steam would roll off the surface of the water, like the rocks were extremely hot. Dahl estimated that this object dropped a whopping 200 tons of this lava rock or slag into the harbor and onto his boat. The debris would strike Dahl's boat repeatedly, and his crew was forced to duck for cover and eventually bring the boat back into shore to avoid the falling debris. In this process, Dahl's son was actually hit by a piece of this falling rock material, and it broke his arm. The crew's dog was also hit by a chunk of this debris, which unfortunately killed him. According to Dahl, on their way back into port, they buried the dog at sea. When telling his boss/business partner Fred Chrisman about the incident that occurred near Maury Island, Chrisman was reportedly skeptical, and that if this incident took place, that he would go to the beach where the UFO was sighted to see if he could collect some of this lava rock slag debris that Dahl was talking about. When Chrisman arrived at the beach, he collected some of the material, and according to Chrisman, also had a sighting of these large donut-shaped objects in the sky. Chrisman collected some of this slag material and in turn contacted Ray Palmer, a writer. Chrisman also supposedly sent a sample of this quote-unquote slag to a friend of his at the University of Chicago, where this friend said they could not identify what this material was. Now, the day after Dahl's sighting in Puget Sound near Maury Island, on June 22nd, Harold Dahl would get a visit by a mysterious individual. This mysterious man, as Dahl would describe him, was a tall man wearing a black suit. Initially, Dahl thought that he was a prospective client for him and Chrisman's business. However, that was not the case. The man instructed Dahl to follow him to a nearby diner. The man in the black suit got into a 1947 Buick, and the two men drove to said nearby diner. At this point, Dahl knew he was no business client and must be some type of military official, even though the man would never give his name or credentials. While the two men ate, this is when the man in the black suit would discuss the details about Dahl's sighting, most of which, to this point, Dahl had not disclosed publicly. This little sit-down was actually before Dahl had mentioned the incident occurring to Fred Chrisman, meaning, according to Dahl, he was the only one, with the exception of this unnamed crew members, who saw the UFO that day. The man in the black suit gave Dahl a very stern warning that if Dahl had spoken publicly about his sighting, some sort of harm would befall his family. Now, this is all according to Dahl, of course. Now, after these events occurred with the Man in Black, which quite possibly could be the first recorded incident of the Men in Black that often come with some high-profile UFO cases, and of course Chrisman sending the samples out to be tested, this is where Ray Palmer would start to be more involved. Ray Palmer, the writer I mentioned just a little bit earlier, contacted Fred Chrisman about this story and the separate sightings that both him and Dahl had. Ray Palmer contacted Kenneth Arnold. As we briefly discussed, ever since the sighting on Mount Rainier, Arnold had become more interested in the UFO phenomenon, and when Ray Palmer contacted Arnold, Palmer said that he would pay Arnold $200 to go and investigate the veracity of the story and whether or not he thinks that what Dahl and Chrisman saw was real. Arnold agreed to take the job from Palmer, considering that this would be kind of an easy way to earn $200, and with Arnold's increased interest in UFOs, he took Palmer up on the offer. Now, this is a part of the story that is listed in Arnold's biography, but in some other sources I read don't mention, but I think it's a neat part of the story. That kind of overall adds to the mystery. Arnold would fly from his home in Boise, Idaho, to Tacoma, Washington, to meet with Dahl and Chrisman. When he arrived in Tacoma, he had to look around for a hotel to stay at for the duration of his time in Tacoma, and he looked around town. Many hotels were fully booked. This is until Arnold called the higher-end hotel in town, called the Winthrop Hotel, to see if they had any availability. Skeptical but desperate, he had asked, and the concierge at the Winthrop Hotel shockingly said they already had a reservation under Arnold's name. That, of course, confused Arnold, as he did not make the reservation prior, of course, and Ray Palmer did not mention anything to him about booking a reservation for him. It was quite odd and kind of strange, and Arnold didn't want to take the reservation from perhaps another Kenneth Arnold out there, but he was desperate and decided to take it. When arriving in Tacoma and checking into the Winthrop Hotel, this is where Arnold would meet with Dahl and Chrisman. In addition to this, Arnold enlisted the help of Captain E.J. Smith as well to come and investigate these claims. Arnold and Smith were very skeptical of the story that Dahl and Chrisman were telling them about. Dahl was more reserved in his storytelling, albeit very detailed, while Chrisman was much more over the top and extravagant in his descriptions, almost like he was trying to sell something. And this kind of rubbed Arnold and Smith in a way that made them think perhaps Dahl and Chrisman weren't telling the full story. To add to this mystery, and we will discuss all of this here in kind of a brief little recap once we finish the story. Over the few days Arnold and Smith met with Dahl and Chrisman in Tacoma, a reporter was supposedly getting leaked information about these meetings that were taking place in the Winthrop Hotel. Now, this reporter named Ted Morello worked for the Tacoma Times and actually called and spoke to Arnold on the phone that someone, aka an informant of some sort, was leaking the information about the meetings Dahl, Chrisman, Arnold, and Smith were having in the hotel room at the Winthrop Hotel. Now, this information that Ted Morello shared to Arnold was supposedly so detailed, Kenneth Arnold thought that there must have been a bug in his hotel room. Arnold, of course, looked around for any trace of a bug or recording device in his room and did not find any. But now, back to Dahl and Chrisman. Even though Arnold and Smith were skeptical about the events that took place near Maury Island, Arnold wanted a second opinion. This is when he contacted Captain William Davidson and Lieutenant Frank Brown of the U.S. Air Force at Hamilton Field, California. Davidson and Brown had interviewed Arnold after his experience near Mount Rainier and felt like he could trust them to possibly retrieve a sample of this so-called lava rock slag from Dahl and Chrisman and get it tested by the military. Davidson and Brown made the trip to Tacoma and also interviewed Dahl and Chrisman, took one of these supposed samples of this slag material from Chrisman, which Chrisman had stored in a large Kellogg cereal box. Davidson and Brown then took the material and off they went back to Hamilton Field. However, tragedy would strike. Davidson and Brown would never make it back to Hamilton Field, California, as the B-25 bomber plane they were in was headed back to California and ended up suffering a catastrophic failure in the left engine, which engulfed it in flames in the air. 2 members of the crew were able to parachute out of the bomber to safety. However, Davidson and Brown were killed in the crash where the plane went down near Kelso, Washington. Arnold would find this information out the following morning from reporter Ted Morello, the same reporter that called him to give him the tidbit of info about a possible informant. The crash of the B-25 bomber in Kelso, Washington sparked a series of conspiracies, such as the plane being shot down by some type of 20mm cannon, and that this was an inside job of some sort as a cover-up. However, these conspiracies and these thoughts that it could have been an inside job hold zero merit and were merely conspiracies. Every bit of this story didn't make a whole lot of sense. During the investigation, Dahl and Chrisman took Arnold to inspect their boat, but the damage was minimal, and nothing could be proven, as it looked like repairs had already been done to the boat, and Dahl had claimed as well to have taken photographs of these donut-shaped objects, and those too seemingly disappeared, as Dahl claimed to have them in the glove box of his car, and then they suddenly disappeared. He attributed this to someone possibly breaking in and stealing them from his car, as they did not want the story to leak out, and that there was some sort of cover-up taking place. There was very little proof to the story, and the proof that Dahl and Chrisman did have was the slag, and unfortunately, that wasn't a smoking gun either. At this point, Arnold wanted out of the story. The story of Dahl and Chrisman and their supposed sightings have inadvertently caused the deaths of 2 U.S. servicemen who Arnold had known somewhat personally. He wanted out, and he contacted Ray Palmer and told him that he, again, wanted out. And Palmer tried to convince Arnold to keep investigating, but it wasn't worth it to Arnold. Arnold would leave Tacoma and fly back home to Boise, Idaho. This event was firmly in his brain and was detailed extensively in his memoir. After the plane crash in Kelso, Washington of the B-25 containing Davidson and Brown, the FBI would now get involved. And when pressuring Dahl about his sighting, he cracked and claimed that this entire sighting at Maury Island was a hoax, and so did Chrisman. Now, Dahl would later recant this statement and claim the incident was actually in fact true, and that he just said that because he felt pressured, but the damage was done. And at this point, no one believed what Dahl and Chrisman saw was real. Analysis of the quote-unquote slag would come back as nothing more than industrial waste, most likely from a local smelter there in Tacoma. If anything, the incident was one big wild goose chase that unfortunately took the lives of 2 U.S. servicemen. Now, even though this might conclude the part of our episode on Kenneth Arnold in the Maury Island Incident, I want to move into some other sightings from across the United States during this time and the overall ripple effect that the Arnold sighting had on the UFO community, some of course more credible than others. Fast forward to July 7th, 1947, William Rhodes, a musician, amateur photographer, and radio operator, clearly a man of many talents, was at home in Phoenix, Arizona. Now, anyone out there who has done research on Phoenix, Arizona, and UFOs, the first thing you might think of is the Phoenix Lights. However, this sighting and photographs that would become known as the Rhodes photographs would add to this hysteria and craze surrounding UFOs in 1947. William Rhodes was at home, heading out to his backyard to head into his workshop that he had built in his backyard. While walking to his workshop that late afternoon, he heard a strange sound coming from the sky to the west. He looked but didn't see anything at first until he panned his vision towards the north, and that is when he saw an elliptical, flat gray object approximately 20 to 30 feet long flying through the air towards the ground. Rhodes witnessed the object descend rapidly from roughly 5,000 feet to 2,000 feet and estimated its speed at roughly 400 to 600 miles an hour. Rhodes thought quick on his feet and ran inside of his workshop and grabbed his Kodak Brownie box camera and snapped some photos of the UFO. And I have to say, they are pretty compelling, to say the least. When this mystery craft exited from Rhodes' view, due to the excitement and madness going on with UFO craze, Rhodes wasted little time heading to the papers with this story and his sighting, and within the following day, the newspapers were reporting on this mystery craft and showing these strange photos of this UFO. However, it turns out just as fast as Rhodes' story tore up the papers, the government had also caught wind of this sighting, and they themselves wasted no time investigating. They contacted the local paper to find out more information about the story and requested more information about the man who sent in these photographs, and they would launch their own investigation. During this time period, it is important to note that pretty much all of these sightings were, and by sightings I mean any UFO sighting that was being sent in during this kind of 1947 time period, and even after this, were being categorized by the government through multiple different organizational handles. The first being Project Sign, a top-secret program designed to investigate this type of quote-unquote flying saucer reports. Project Sign would morph a few times into Project Grudge, and later into the infamous handle of Project Blue Book. As federal inquiries were being made into the Rhodes sighting and photographs, the U.S. government finally conducted a sit-down interview of their own with William Rhodes in August of 1947. In this interview, and prior and after said interview, numerous claims were made being about Rhodes' character traits and whether or not Rhodes was a credible witness. Some claims would probably be considered character assassinations today, with some even including that Rhodes' mother was a Russian immigrant and that his affiliations might have been elsewhere. Others criticized his business connections and overall whether he could be trusted. However, the photos remained compelling, and perhaps what could be the most compelling of all, and what the U.S. government thought as well, was the stark similarities between the photographs that Rhodes took and the objects described by Kenneth Arnold during his sighting at Mount Rainier. The similarities were too much to ignore, as much as the U.S. government doubted and speculated. When William Rhodes was brought in for an interview, he was interviewed by two men who at first identified themselves, and I quote, as representatives of the U.S. government. However, the men would go on to identify themselves as Special Agent George Fugate Jr. of Counterintelligence Corps and Special Agent Brower of the FBI. Brower would never give his first name. Now, the agents, Fugate Jr. and Brower, requested both Rhodes' photographs that he took as well as the negatives from his camera, which he gave up willingly. Now, the agents in question quite possibly helped add fuel to the fire that is the Men in Black, as it was common practice for the government to be wearing plain black suits and their agents be wearing plain black suits and ties during this time period. Of course, if Harold Dahl was in fact telling the truth about the agent that visited him back in Tacoma, Washington, it would show that perhaps the myth of the Men in Black started with these early reports and the government's involvement with them, and the idea that if you saw a UFO and you had a story to tell, you would get a visit from these agents in all black. The Rhodes photographs are, in my opinion, a crucible piece of the puzzle in this UFO craze. And to add to this entire time period, one day after William Rhodes had his sighting, the infamous Roswell incident took place, and I could do a whole episode on the Roswell incident, and I most likely will down the road. So I'll be saving that bit for later. So within this month-and-a-half time frame, of course, and the months that followed, you had sightings after sightings all across the U.S., and the United States was gripped by the flying saucer. You had sightings coming in from all across the United States, so many to the point it would be impossible for me to cover them all. But with all this being stated, and all of this out there, and the brunt of this story being told, and the brunt of this all being talked about, let's dive into theories about the Flying Saucer Craze, Kenneth Arnold sighting, as well as the Maury Island Incident. Now, instead of me listing theories about all three of these kind of separate instances and separate sightings and separate stories, let me just give you my personal theory on this entire thing and where I stand. Of course, you were all more than willing to provide me with your own thoughts and opinions in the comment section as well. Now, when it comes to Kenneth Arnold's sighting, I think it was genuine. I don't see any reason for him to make a story like this up, especially considering before this sighting, the UFO phenomenon wasn't really a thing. So for Kenneth Arnold to create something completely new, kind of seems unlikely. I know the idea of alien invasion wasn't a new concept, because of course War of the Worlds was a very popular story in the years before this kind of UFO craze. However, UFOs were a new thing, and I don't think Arnold would simply make up the story. He never really profited off the story, and the little bit he did, he described in his memoir, and this was of course many years after the story. I think his sighting was real. When it comes to Maury Island, I think this was a hoax. I don't think it took place on the 21st, because that would put it before Arnold's sighting, and I don't think that happened. Instead, what I think happened was that Dahl and Chrisman made up the story after Arnold's sighting and ran with it to try and see how whimsical they could make their story to possibly get in the papers, or even take it further than that. Depending on the sources you look through, they of course describe Dahl and Chrisman's tale to both Arnold and Captain E.J. Smith as very detailed and very story-esque, like this was rehearsed and designed to sound like this. Of course, Dahl and Chrisman would tell the U.S. government this was a hoax, and when they did, that turns out, shortly after telling the government this was a hoax, Chrisman would disappear, seemingly making this all out to be a hoax that they tried to sell, and unfortunately, it spiraled way too out of control for them, and 2 U.S. servicemen got killed because of it. It got way too serious, way too quickly, when in reality, it was a fake story made up for profit or for front page headlines. I think when it comes to the flying saucer craze that took the United States by storm, it is impossible to say what sightings were genuine or what were hoaxes. But it is no shocker that people were trying to capture the hype train of what was going on. Take the Twin Falls hoax, for example. This was another hoax made during this June-July timeframe of 1947, where people witnessed a flying saucer crash into a backyard in Idaho. And when police and the military investigated, it was a fake prop made by teenagers as a hoax, clearly hearing the stories about saucers over the Northwest and making themselves a part of the story. I am overall a UFO believer, but I am not, of course, a skeptic through the lens of facts. And I have to imagine some of these other sightings were mostly fakes, because of what the newspapers were reading. I mean, every day it was like another story was gripping the front page papers. Pretty much all you had to do is say that you had a sighting and make up a story, and bam, you were on the front page. Overall, I think Arnold, E.J. Smith, and the Flight 105 crew, and William Rhodes' sightings were all real. However, you had others, such as Dahl, Chrisman, and the teenagers in Twin Falls, ride the coattails of a serious event in an effort to get public attention. Of course, that is my own theory. You are more entitled to all of your own, and I actually want to hear them. So if you want to drop those down in the comments for me, I greatly appreciate it. I am active in the comments. I do respond to the comments. So if you do go down into the comment section and comment on my content, I do respond to them. But with that being said, that's going to kind of do it for this week's episode on Kenneth Arnold, the Maury Island Incident, Flight 105, the 1947 Flying Saucer Craze. Again, a whole bunch of kind of topics lumped together in one, and I felt like I wanted to do them all together because, like I said, the more I dug into this story, it was almost like you couldn't tell one story without incorporating them all together. And there could have been certain aspects of this story that I might have briefly brushed over, and for that I apologize. Of course, very often, and those of you who have been following me for a long time know that I'm just a one-man band here, and I dedicate a lot of my free time to doing this. So unfortunately, sometimes little tidbits of information often get overlooked or left out for the sake of either convenience or for storytelling, whatever it may be. And if there is pertinent information that I did miss, that you want to fill me in on and say, hey, you missed this big part, again, you can send me an email. That's at Unblurring the Unknown. And when you're sending me that email, you can send me topic suggestions. Same email handle, unblurringtheunknown@gmail.com. You can also send them to me Instagram direct message. But with all that being said, I think that's going to do it for me on this week's episode. Again, I apologize about the inconsistent posting of episodes. Hope to get back to a consistent rate every Tuesday like I usually do. I want to get back to doing that on a regular basis, and I appreciate you all having patience with me. But with that all being said, that's going to do it for me. If you were listening to this on Spotify, please turn on post notifications so you get notified every time I post a new episode. If you're listening to this on YouTube, please like, comment, subscribe. It helps me out greatly. Send me some topic suggestions on my Instagram, also Unblurring the Unknown, or to my email, unblurringtheunknown@gmail.com. I love episode suggestions. I add them to the queue, and I get to them as soon as I can. With all that being said, I appreciate you turning in to this week's episode, and I will see you all on the next one.